Hello, everyone. My name's Tory, and you're watching Cortree TV. Today, we're talking about disability and work. Our guest today is Mahadeo Sukhai, Chief Research Officer and Chief Accessibility Officer and VP International Affairs at the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, also known as CNIB. And Mahadeo is co-founder of Idea STEM, an organization dedicated to accessibility in science training, education, and research. Welcome to the show, Mahadeo.
Thanks very much, Tory.
Okay, just get us started. Why don't you tell us a bit about your work and your background? What do you do?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with my background. So I have a PhD in genetics and molecular biology. I'm a cancer geneticist by training, and I started out as a basic science researcher and moved into something called translational research, which is sort of doing research that has application to human society benefit. And for me, that was genetics research that had application to human society benefit. And then I moved from there into what we call health services research or health outcomes research. And then from there into sort of public health sciences and social determinants of health research. And so I went from a career in academic healthcare to a career in running a research department in a nonprofit organization. And the kind of research that I do is very much understanding quality of life and lived experience of people in Canada who are blind, deafblind, and partially sighted, and people with sensory disabilities and perceptual or print disabilities as well. Now, that's part of who I am as a professional. It's part of what I do. I'm also an accessibility professional, and I serve as CNIB's Chief Accessibility Officer, and I've spent 20 years sort of developing this career as an accessibility professional that started when I was a graduate student in the University of Toronto. And so I'm unique, or relatively unique, I should say. There's others who have similar skill sets in that I've been a scientist for more than 2 decades. I've been an accessibility professional for 2 decades, and those two things sit side by side together. And outside of my day job, I'm tremendously passionate about accessibility in science training and science education, because as a scientist with a disability, I know how difficult that entire space has been. And so I'm happy to spend time within that space to improve its accessibility for the next generation of scientists and the generation after that.
So, what's your perspective on where we are now as far as accessibility in STEM?
Over the past 15 years, there have been some pretty disruptive technologies that have been developed. And I think about the iPhone, I think about tablet. And both of these two devices have had significant impact on accessibility generally, on the lived experience of people with disabilities, people with vision loss, people with print disabilities. But despite the presence of such disruptive technologies, the proportion of people with sensory disabilities in particular, in science, technology, engineering, math, medicine, and healthcare has not substantively increased over 20 years ago. You will find the occasional person who is deaf. You will find the odd person who's blind or partially sighted, but odds are you're going to go across entire disciplines before encountering somebody. And you would think that with disruptive technologies like the smartphone and the tablet, things would have changed. And the fact is that they haven't, which suggests that the problem isn't a technology problem, right? The problem is an attitudinal problem. It's how we think about disability as a society. It's how we think about disability and what that means to being able to do something, and how we think through that. And that's actually impacting how we teach our students. It's impacting how we hire our employees, not just in STEM, but STEM is where it's most egregious.
So, what was it like for you coming up through your science education and research opportunities?
Interesting. And I will qualify. I'm going to qualify the word. Interesting is it's a nice euphemism, right? Everything is interesting. But here's the truth of it. At the time that I was doing my undergrad, when a genetics prof in my third year said, "You're the first blind geneticist that I ever heard of," actually validating that was a bit of a difficult chore. I'm not necessarily going to date myself, but there's pre-Google and then there's post-Google, and the third year undergrad Mahadeo was pre-Google, right? And so I was told this, and I had to validate it. And one might wonder, how does one actually validate things pre-Google? And the truth is, there's ways to do it, and it actually requires a little bit more brute force searching, but you can actually still you can still work in the absence of Google. And it took me a while, but I did indeed figure out that this person actually was right, that there hadn't been another person who was congenitally blind who had gone into genetics directly. Now, there's an exception to that. The father of population genetics, a fellow by the name of Thomas Fisher, had what I think is retinitis pigmentosa, if you read between the lines of his biography and you actually understand kind of his lived experience. But the interesting thing about Thomas Fisher was he actually was a mathematician. He was a statistician. He wasn't a geneticist, and so he wasn't the kind of bench researcher that I ended up becoming. And so when I went into that space, I did something that a lot of people didn't think that I could do or should do. And growing up, I had parents, and they're still alive, so I have parents who were wonderful human beings, and who, because we grew up in the Caribbean, there wasn't a CNIB around. And because there wasn't a CNIB around, there was no Caribbean National Institute for the Blind, or Barbadian National Institute for the Blind, or Guyanese National Institute for the Blind. So my parents had to make it up as they went along. There was no authority figure to say Mahadeo could do this. There was also no authority figure to say Mahadeo could not do this. And the interesting thing is, in the absence of an authority figure who could say anything, right, then my parents had the chance to say, okay, he wants to be a scientist. Do we let him be a scientist? Do we not let him be a scientist? How do we stop him from being a scientist? Of course, we can stop him from being a scientist. We're his parents, but we're not going to do that because we believe in the value of education. And so there wasn't an itinerant teacher who said, no, you can't do that. There wasn't a real teacher, a classroom teacher who said, no, you can't do that. There wasn't an orientation and mobility specialist or an early childhood intervention specialist said, what do you talk about? You can't be a scientist, right? And so it was nice to not actually have that kind of barrier, because what I've discovered is in a global north country like Canada, an astonishing number of people will present that barrier in the guise of knowing what we're talking about, right? No, you can't do that. I know better, right? And so I never had that. And when I started to encounter that in my post-secondary education, it kind of threw me for a bit of a loop. It was very flummoxing. And it was hard to sort of reconcile that with my desire for an education and a career that I wanted, that I felt was going to be beneficial to me. But then the other side of that is that also brought a fair bit of stress and challenge, right? So I was the first blind geneticist. I am the first blind geneticist. And so the question becomes, if you're the only one and nobody else got there before you, what did they do wrong and you do right? Or put it another way, what did you do wrong and they do right? And the imposter syndrome creeps in. Why are you here? Why do you want to be here? Is this the right place for you? And these are questions I'm asking myself, right? So imposter syndrome and the phenomenon of having to trailblaze the whole way was actually rather stressful. And so I made it to the end, long story short, bachelor's, master's, PhD, 2 postdocs, right? But then the other issue is nobody will actually hire you. And how do you as a person who can demonstrate that you know what you're doing, who can demonstrate that you have a skill set, how do you then navigate a space where no matter how many times you demonstrate that skill set, people won't necessarily give you an opportunity to keep doing that? I think back to my master's, only one person actually offered me an acceptance letter. I think back to my PhD, only one person offered me an acceptance letter. I think back to both of my postdocs. And in both postdocs combined, only one person offered me an acceptance letter. My first postdoc was actually with my PhD supervisor, right? And I think about the hundreds of applications that I put in to academic institutions to serve as faculty. I got 5 interviews and I came second 3 times. I didn't come first, otherwise I'd have a faculty appointment. That wasn't an adjunct faculty appointment because I have a couple of those, right? And so so, I look back on that and I say, was I able to succeed? Yes, but I succeeded because I ended up changing the rules. I ended up defining my own definition of success. I pulled the Jim Kirk thing from Star Trek, right? And I took the no-win scenario and I reprogrammed it,
Hmm.
right? And if I didn't do that, then where would I be? I'd be in a space that in the context of the kind of work that I wanted to do would be considered basically an evolutionary dead end from a career perspective. And so I remade the rules. I remade the rules as a PhD student. I remade the rules as a postdoc. I remade the rules in my first job out of my postdoc, working in academic healthcare. And I remade the rules with the encouragement and approval of my bosses at CNIB, right? And the funny thing is, there's a lot of people who are blind or partially sighted, a lot of people with disabilities who will sort of be like, okay, well, you know what? The world sucks. Employment sucks, right? And the only way that I'm actually going to have control over what I want to do is if I make my own rules and make my own space. And it's not easy to be that kind of entrepreneur. It's not easy to sort of set yourself up in that domain. And at the end of the day, I did sort of kick the tires on being a full-time consultant a couple of times in life, but I haven't had to go down that road as yet. And when I do choose to go down that road, I now get to do so with the ability to have said that I've been a researcher, I've been an accessibility professional, I've been an educator, and so I can legitimize that entrepreneurial thing. It's not the first thing that I've done.
I want to return to the concept that you shared of making your own rules. And I'm wondering if you can say a little about how that aligns or doesn't align with the conventional idea of job accommodation.
So the funny thing with job accommodation, the way that the rules are set up, you don't have to say to somebody, I'm blind, or I have a congenital visual impairment, or I'm deaf, or I'm neurodiverse, or whatever. But you do have an obligation, according to the human rights codes and according to the employment legislation, to say, I require, and the buzzword is an accommodation. I have an accommodation that I need. And so I don't have to say to people, I have bilateral congenital cataracts with deprivation, amblyopia, and nystagmus, because frankly, nobody knows what that is, except an ophthalmologist and me, right? But I have an obligation to say, I need large print. I need things big. But the thing is, when I do that, an employer has an obligation to then say, well, why do you need things big? And to ask a series of increasingly invasive questions about why I need things big until they're satisfied that I really do need things big. And then that employer has an obligation to think through whether me needing things big, for example, is going to interfere with the work that they hired me to do, right? And so the system is set up in such a way so that I have control over when I talk. But the thing is, if I don't talk up front, then people are going to think I've kept secrets. I've been disingenuous somehow. And if I'm disingenuous about this, what else am I going to be disingenuous about? And then a whole trust issue evolves, right? And people will say, yeah, it's not the greatest system, but the system works. And I disagree. I don't think the system works. And I think the system is set up for failure. The system is actually set up for our failure, right? And so if we're going to change the rules, then does that also mean let's reimagine the system? Wouldn't it be great if we actually lived in a world where instead of me having to ask for large print, everything was Verdana font size 14 by default, as opposed to Calibri size 8, right? As an exaggerated comedic example, right? If wouldn't it be great if we lived in a world where instead of me saying I work best with natural light, we actually had offices that had windows in strategic places for people who needed natural light. And for people who don't need natural light, then you don't have natural light. You don't go near a window, right? Wouldn't it be great if instead of saying, I need audio and braille and tactile in the elevator, every elevator was audio, braille, and tactile, right? And so wouldn't it be great if we actually set the world up and set the employment of people generally, not just people with disabilities, but all people, up in such a way so that the environments that we went to work in, the environments that we lived in, the environments that we played in, the environments that we, went to healthcare providers in, whatever, actually we're more inclusive and accessible from the get-go. Do they have to be perfect? That'd be ideal, but no, right? But the thing is that if you took every form that a human being had to interact with, and you turn that form from Calibri size 9 or Calibri size 10 or Times New Roman size 10 to Verdana size 14 and just reformatted the darn thing, right? Then suddenly you've taken the request for large print material and cut the number of requests that you're going to get from 1,000 in a day to maybe 50 in a day, right? And even for those 50, then the thing is naturally more useful to start with, right? Or you provide that form in Verdana 14 to start with, as opposed to Calibri 9, and you provide it as an audio, and you provide it as a braille, and you provide it online, and suddenly the 50 requests you might get are actually now down to maybe 2.
Would that be your best advice for hiring managers and HR professionals that are trying to hire and create a more diverse and inclusive workforce?
The best advice that I would give a hiring manager and the best advice I would give an HR professional is, what are your assumptions, right? When I first started at CNIB, I had a conversation with somebody on our philanthropy team about trying to fundraise for scholarships for students who were blind or partially sighted who wanted to do STEM in post-secondary. And I said, we really should do this. And this person clearly didn't look me up before we had this conversation, said to me, I don't understand, blind people can't do science. And I said, you should go look me up and then we should have a conversation. And I didn't say that to boast. That was the only thing I ever heard, right? And so what are our assumptions? Can we question our assumptions, right? Are our assumptions that just because somebody is neurodiverse, they're not able to read, or just because somebody has a learning disability, they can't do math, or just because somebody is blind means they can't actually look down a microscope, or somebody who is deaf can't work in customer service, right? Are we making those kinds of assumptions because there's something about disability? Hell, the word is a problem, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Is there something about the concept of different abilities and different ways of doing things that acts as a bit of a trigger for us? And the answer is yes. As a species, that's absolutely true. We're xenophobic by nature, right? Evolutionarily, that was a good thing on the savannah 100,000 years ago. It's not such a great thing now, but at one point in time it was probably beneficial, right? And we have to get past that. We have to be able to question our assumptions that are based on the 30-second judgment call that we get about what a person can or can't do when they come into an interview room, or when we talk with them on a phone, or when we see them for the first time or interact with them for the first time, right?
So what would your advice be for the job seeker who's coming up against those assumptions and feeling frustrated and maybe like it's too hard?
Don't make it about a but. Make it about an and I'll explain that. We teach people to self-advocate, and by self-advocate I mean disclose, right? But the thing is, the way that we teach people to disclose is actually kind of interesting to me, because when we teach people to disclose, it's usually and I'm going to take my own example again. I have a visual impairment, but I can do science, right? What's wrong if we flip that around and say, here's my resume. This is how competent I am, and I need large print, right? And I've had students, and I've had people who are blind say to me when I've said this, those sound exactly like the same thing, and I can understand that. And in reality, you would, if you're thinking about it on a surface level, the difference between I have a disability, but I can do the job, and I can do the job and I need an accommodation, it's very subtle, right? Very, very subtle. But on the other hand, if you position it so that it isn't about the disability, but it is about what you can do in school or in the workplace or in the community or as a volunteer or wherever, then it's, hey, look at what I can contribute. Look at what I bring to this team, right? And by the way, I need big things.
Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Can you tell our viewers again where they can go to learn more about IdeaSTEM?
www.idea-stem.ca.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Welcome.